Hello, my inquisitive history lovers. Welcome to my channel Reliving American History with a history lover who's never been to America. Oh, the time machine is waiting. Let's waste no time. Today we are going to the 1950s to dig up the roots of the post-Second World War Red Scare and find out what it was like for American citizens to live under Joe McCarthy's watchful and suspicious eye. By the 1950s, a Red Scare was no news for American citizens. They had already experienced two of them, a post-First World War Red Scare and a New Deal Red Scare. Both had their little-known highlights. In the spring, fall, and winter of 1918, American soldiers found themselves in a daily deadly struggle with Bolsheviks in the far cold north of Russia. More than 200 of them died in action. Others succumbed to disease, wounds, and the freezing temperatures. The survivors, who never knew why they were there, why they were fighting and freezing and dying in hostile Russia, would come to refer to themselves sarcastically as polar bears. The Polar Bear Expedition, the US armed intervention in the Russian Civil War on behalf of the White Russians, is a curious, little-known event, which, however, influenced the subsequent Soviet-American relations and provoked the mistrust between the two great powers of the 20th century. While the Americans tended to sweep it under the rug, the Soviets remembered it as an act of invasion up to the downfall of the USSR. Let's move on to the New Deal Red Scare. Franklin Delano Roosevelt sent shockwaves through Wall Street with his antitrust policies and broad interpretation of federal power. There were rumors that he himself was a communist, or at least pink, and in a plot like no other, prominent Wall Street bankers and Nazi sympathizers attempted to persuade with a generous sum General Smedley Butpler, a Marine Corps hero who had been hailed as an outstanding soldier by Theodore Roosevelt himself, to lead an army of veterans on Washington and overthrow the Roosevelt administration. Fortunately, Butler preferred to reveal the scandalous plot to the press, and the USA was spared a military overtake. Oh, but we have arrived, I guess. Oh, yes, we're in the 1950s. Welcome, and let's go to the post-Second World War Red Scare. If there were already two Red Scares before it, you might wonder what made the post-Second World War Red Scare so special. Actually, there were four reasons. First, the American development of an atomic bomb, a weapon of unparalleled destruction that from the beginning was understood to have the capacity to destroy humanity. Second, the Soviet recruitment and use of American spies to get access to American military secrets, especially the knowledge of atomic weaponry. And third, the national response to the rapid expansion of communism all over the globe. In addition, the military-industrial complex was reluctant to lose the money and the power that came with it, which it had gained during World War II. During the war, the USA had become a warfare state in order to defeat Nazi Germany and make Europe safe for democracy. It relatively succeeded. To the military-industrial complex's disappointment, even the war to start wars all over again ended. Now America was about to make an about-face and demobilize. Unacceptable. The only way to keep the war machine working at full pace was to find a new enemy. Nothing could have been easier. I mean, it was obvious. There, an ocean apart, lay a gigantic country headed by an aggressive dictator and governed by an ideology fervently opposed to capitalism. World communism again loomed menacingly on the US horizon like a sinister apparition. Or did it? In the 1950s, Americans were high on success and economic prosperity. They had survived the Great Depression, battled Hitler, and bombed Imperial Japan into surrender. Unlike Secretary of State John Foster Dulles, they were tired of going abroad in search of monsters to destroy. They wanted to enjoy the skyrocketing standard of life, buy cars, and raise big, happy families. Special efforts had to be made to convince them danger was still hovering over their heads. Yet, the dollars flowing into the defense and armament budgets were a powerful stimulus for the military-industrial complex. And they had the best weapon: propaganda. The CIA, this ever-vigilant guardian against communist influence, summoned its army of writers and journalists, all enticed with the promise of fame or threatened with career ruin, and the American Goebbelses threw themselves into the task of brainwashing and frightening the American people. With the national defense mobilized to the utmost, the USA did not have to fear much from the outside. To instill true terror in the minds of Americans, the media aimed to impress on them that the enemy had infiltrated governmental agencies, that it was among us. No need to say that the FBI and the CIA are masters of their craft, and that the propaganda campaign proved to be more than effective, sowing panic in the hearts of Americans. Ironically, though, it was so well conducted that its creators got taken in by their own propaganda. The artificially created Red Scare became real, seeping into all levels of the US government. This is the only way to explain how the phenomenon McCarthyism happened. Early in the 1950s, also known as the whirl of the growing Red Scare, Joseph R. McCarthy, an obscure Republican senator from Wisconsin, was suddenly propelled to the forefront of American news by his declaration of an all-out attack on communist spies in the government. McCarthy took up the cause of anti-communism with a fiery speech to a women's Republican club in Wheeling, West Virginia, on February 9, 1950, in which he charged that the State Department was infested with communists. He even claimed to have their names. But one insignificant detail has to be mentioned: he never provided those names. At those tumultuous times of terror, however, this was not important. Joe McCarthy successfully fed the fear already deeply engraved in the mind of the average newspaper-reading American. His reckless charges created a media sensation. Or should I say, the media seized the opportunity to make a sensation out of his claims? I think each one of us should decide for himself. What matters is that everything went downhill from there. Joe McCarthy had come a long way from the Wisconsin dairy farm where he had grown up. His search for communists was not an investigation. It was a witch hunt reminiscent of the Salem witch trials. Even the military-industrial complex came to regret the fact they had let this monster loose. No one, from the loftiest general or cabinet member to the lowliest government clerk, was immune from McCarthy's suspicious gaze. His most favorite target, as I already mentioned, was the US State Department, which according to him was teeming with communists. He attacked it mercilessly, dragging its employees before his Senate Permanent Subcommittee on Investigations. There, instead of providing actual evidence, which simply did not exist, he bullied and browbeat them into confessing their non-existent communist sympathies. Harry Truman privately denounced McCarthy, as just a ballyhoo artist who has to cover up his shortcomings with wild charges. But the raging senator was not so easily dismissed. He was a monster of the Republican Party's own creation, and enjoyed the backing of the unscrupulous Nixon, who in turn was backed by the CIA and other Republicans, all eager to hurt Democrats in the 1950 congressional elections by convincing America they were soft on communism. Lyndon Johnson said McCarthy was the sorriest senator in Washington, but he's riding high now, he's got people scared to death. Well, that was the goal after all. Scare Americans to death so that they would support the continuing rearmament, enlarge the defense budget, and enrich the military-industrial giants. As Eisenhower took over the White House in 1953, it was uncertain whether the most dynamic force in Washington would be the widely popular new president or the senator from Wisconsin. Eisenhower confided that he reviled McCarthy nearly as much as Adolf Hitler, but he kept pulling back from confronting him. McCarthy, for his part, quickly made clear that he considered the new Republican administration fair game. Nobody in the Capitol was safe. The senator would boldly target the three institutions at the very center of Washington's global power: the State Department, the CIA, and the Army. The last would be his undoing. The State Department became the target of no less than 10 separate, ongoing congressional investigations by McCarthy, who saw it as a hotbed of communists, pinkos, and other soft types. His relentless probes daunted even the solemn, formidable Secretary of State John Foster Dulles, who was widely known for his policy of brinksmanship and hatred towards communism. In spite of all his efforts and rage, Joe found no evidence of communist sympathies against any State Department officials. This, of course, did not prevent his witch hunt from ruining reputations, careers, and lives by bluntly and irrationally accusing many of those employees of communist affiliations. On top of that, the unstoppable senator soon found a new target: homosexuals. Here, the ridiculousness of the whole phenomenon reaches its climax. The thing is that McCarthy could not run his high carnival alone. He had a right hand, Roy Cohn, a vicious and unprincipled mob-connected attorney. Just look at photos of him. He looks like a snake. While he himself was a closeted gay man, Cohn threw himself into exposing and accusing all homosexuals who had the misfortune to work in the State Department and other governmental agencies. Homosexual was turned into a synonym for communist. Although at first this sounds absurd, there is a lot of logic behind this horrendous connection. It's the easiest to make people fear something they know little about. And most Americans knew next to nothing about queer people, whom they shunned like the plague because at the time homosexuals were considered to be on the same level as pedophiles and rapists. Mutual consent apparently did not matter. To top the climax, Cohn installed his 26-year-old playmate, a rich son of a hotel tycoon with no particular credentials, named David Shine, on the staff of the witch trials. Essentially, observed one Cold War historian, Shine was Cohn's dumb blonde. Thus, the subcommittee turned into a playground for two gay men who took obvious pleasure in humiliating homosexual witnesses appearing before Joe McCarthy, demanding to know the locations of their illicit trysts and the names of their sexual partners. Some investigation, huh? Ironically, it is exactly because of David Shine that McCarthy's well-constructed control over Washington came crashing down. Shine joined the armed forces, and they decided to send him to a remote base overseas. Naturally, his boyfriend Cohn went ballistic at the news. Out of vengeance, he and McCarthy, who had long ago set his sights on the army, outrageously accused George Marshall, the former Secretary of State and war hero, of making common cause with Stalin. The military-industrial complex was furious. No one touched their precious army. McCarthy's fate was sealed. The army opened an investigation into David Schein. After Schein had been drafted into the army, Roy Cohn sought, with McCarthy's help, to get him exempted from service, and when that did not work, to have him commissioned as an officer. With Schein duly listed as a private, Cohn pressed the Secretary of the Army, Robert Stevens, to give Schein special privileges, with the result that Schein was issued special equipment: mittens rather than gloves, special boots with straps and buckles, a fur-lined hood, and other luxuries. Moreover, Schein was allowed to leave the base on weekends to work on committee business. The Army's report listed 44 counts of improper pressure, among the most glaring being Cohn's threat, if Schein were to be sent overseas, to make sure that Stevens was true and to wreck the army. Schein himself did not mean much to McCarthy, but Roy Cohn was vital to him. By this time, Joe had a very serious drinking problem, a quart or more a day, and he desperately needed Cohn to do much of the committee work. In addition to the embarrassing army investigation, McCarthy was facing a very serious problem behind the scenes. FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover, disturbed by the senator's increasing recklessness, had cut him off from FBI files. Now McCarthy was fighting blindfolded, blinded by the lack of information from his old sources, and blinded by the enormous quantities of alcohol he was consuming morning and night. The puppet masters had decided to get rid of him, so in an unprecedented political drama, they even televised his proceedings, a sight that proved to be unpleasant for the 80 million viewers who got to witness the senator's bullying behavior and dishonest tactics. As a political force, Joe McCarthy was spent. Nobody wields power alone. A person is only as socially and politically strong as his or her base of support. McCarthy had had fairly strong public support, but his performance on television had weakened that dramatically. Just as important, he had been a political asset for his fellow Republicans, while the Democrats had held the White House. With a Republican president, he was no longer needed. Since he had brought unfavorable publicity to himself and had attacked the precious U.S. Army, he could not be tolerated. The age of McCarthy came to its inglorious end. During the 4 years of his reign of terror, he had not uncovered a single communist spy in the government. However, his smear campaign tarnished and ruined lives and reputations. During the Red Scare, thousands of left-wing Americans were blacklisted from employment because of past political associations, real or rumored. Fears of Soviet spies in the United States working with American sympathizers led Congress to pass the McCarran Internal Security Act over President Truman's veto, making it unlawful to combine, conspire, or agree with any other person to perform any act which would substantially contribute to the establishment of a totalitarian dictatorship. Communist organizations had to register with the Attorney General. Would-be immigrants who had belonged to totalitarian parties in their home countries were barred from admission to the United States. And during any future national emergencies, American communists were to be herded into concentration camps. The McCarran Internal Security Act, Truman said in his veto message, would put the government into the business of thought control. The artificially ignited Red Scare had achieved its goals. It had kept the military-industrial complex rich and powerful, and it had curbed the civil liberties of the American people. Our time seems to be up. The time machine is bringing us back to 2021. Thank you very much for traveling with me to the 1950s. Stay tuned for more.